In the autumn of 1750, a merchant vessel from Boston sat at anchor in Bridgetown Harbor, Barbados, and unloaded its cargo onto the docks. The hold held dried and salted cod, packed into barrels and stamped with a grade designation that did not appear on anything shipped to Europe. On the head of each barrel, the designation read, West India Fish. This was not the premium grade. It was too stiff, too coarsely processed, too aggressively salted for the tables of Boston merchants or the fish markets of Lisbon. The grade existed for one purpose. It had been designed to feed enslaved workers on the sugar plantations spreading across the Barbadian interior, at the lowest cost the market would bear. Every autumn, hundreds of ships made this crossing. Merchants in Gloucester and Marblehead and Newburyport shipped cod south to the sugar islands as a matter of routine business. By the middle of the 18th century, the combined volume of salt cod crossing from the New England fisheries to the Caribbean was feeding hundreds of thousands of enslaved people across Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands. Without it, the plantation system as it operated could not have functioned. The fish was not incidental to the Atlantic slave trade. The fish was structural to it. And then consider who sent it, and what they built with the money that came back. But this story does not start at the docks in Bridgetown. It starts in water so cold and so thick with life that the men who first sailed through it could not find words adequate to what they were seeing. If you had asked any English mariner in the late 15th century what lay beyond the western horizon, they would have told you, open ocean and empty sea. The charts did not extend that far. The trade routes did not reach there. What existed at the far end of the North Atlantic was, as far as anyone in England was concerned, nothing of value. They had no idea. In June 1497, a navigator named Giovanni Cabato, working under the name John Cabot and sailing under letters patent from the English crown, reached the coast of what is now Newfoundland. He found fish before he found land. The waters of the continental shelf extending southeast from Newfoundland, the area that would come to be called the Grand Banks, sat over a shallow underwater plateau where cold Arctic water collided with the warmer Gulf Stream and produced conditions of extraordinary biological richness. The fish were there in quantities that defied ready description. A letter, written shortly after the voyage by a Bristol merchant named John Day, addressed to the Lord Grand Admiral and preserved in the Archivo General de Simancas in Valladolid, Spain, described the seas as covered with fish that could be taken not only with the net, but in baskets let down with a stone. Cabot himself, in reports to the English court, estimated that his crew could have filled the vessel many times over. The word that appeared in multiple early accounts was infinite. It was not meant as exaggeration. The species was Atlantic cod, Gadus morhua, a cold water fish that could grow to more than 2 meters in length and live for 20 years, moving through the near-freezing water of the banks in enormous shoals, feeding on the capelin and krill that the upwelling currents kept dense and plentiful. The fish had been there for centuries before any European ship arrived. They had simply not been found. What made cod consequential beyond its abundance was what you could do with it. Cod could be split, rubbed with coarse salt, and dried in open air until it was as rigid as leather. Properly dried, a salt cod lasted 18 months without refrigeration. It could survive the Atlantic crossing in barrels without spoiling. It was dense in protein, light in weight, and cheap to produce wherever there was a coastline and wind. No other fish of comparable nutritional value preserved this reliably. Atlantic cod, cured and dried on the rocks of Newfoundland, was effectively the world's first mass-produced, non-perishable food. The Portuguese were fishing the banks by 1501. The Basques were there before the turn of the century. the French established fishing stations on Cape Breton. By 1550, the fleets of 5 European nations were working the Grand Banks each summer and returning with dried cod for markets in Portugal, Spain, France, England, and across the Mediterranean. The fish fed Catholic Europe through its Lenten fasting seasons. It provisioned armies and navies on campaign. It appeared in the food stores of every long-distance expedition, because nothing else kept as reliably on a long voyage. If those fisheries had remained simply a source of food for the markets of southern Europe, this would be a very different story. By the mid-17th century, the cod trade had become the economic foundation of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The colony's merchants caught cod, dried it, and shipped it east as their primary export. A carved pine fish, gilded and roughly 5 feet long, hung in the chambers of the Massachusetts General Court as a symbol of what the colony ran on. It is still there today. Historians of the period refer to it as the sacred cod, and the name is not entirely ironic. The fish funded the colony's early institutions, paid for its ships, and underlined the commercial networks from which Boston's merchant class grew. But by the early 1700s, the New England fisheries were producing far more cod than the premium European market could absorb. The best quality fish, large and pale and mildly cured, sold well in Portugal and Spain, where Catholic demand for non-meat protein was consistent and willing to pay for quality. The problem was that every voyage also produced large quantities of fish that did not meet the premium standard. Fish that were too small, too thin, too heavily salted during curing, or too stiff from aggressive drying to suit the European palate. This fish had no European market. This is the moment where the story of a fish becomes something else entirely. The New England fishing industry had an oversupply problem, and the solution it found was not a new recipe. The solution was a new grade of fish, explicitly created for a specific buyer, and that buyer was the Caribbean plantation system. Historian W. Jeffrey Bolster, in The Mortal Sea, and Mark Kurlansky, in his 1997 study of the North Atlantic fishery, both document the tiered grading structure that governed New England's salt cod trade. At one end were the premium grades, shipped to Catholic Europe and commanding the highest prices. In the middle were grades consumed in New England itself. At the bottom of the scale was the grade that colonial merchants called Jamaica fish or West India fish. This category was not an unfortunate byproduct. It was a designed product with a designed buyer. The buyer was the plantation economy of the Caribbean, and what it needed was the cheapest possible protein to keep enslaved workers alive and working. And this is the part where things stopped being funny. Salt cod, even the lowest grade, was high in protein and durable over weeks of tropical heat. It could survive the Atlantic crossing in barrels without refrigeration. It could be rationed in small quantities and provide caloric sufficiency, if not comfort. From the perspective of a plantation manager calculating the cost of maintaining a captive labor force, it was close to ideal. And then, the plantation owners of Barbados and Jamaica sent their orders north each season, and New England answered, and the cod trade and the slave trade locked into each other like the parts of a machine. The man who sits at the center of this story, for the city of Boston, is Peter Faneuil. Faneuil was born in 1700 in New Rochelle, New York, to a family of Huguenot merchants who had fled France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. He came to Boston young and worked in the trading house of his uncle, Andrew Faneuil, who had established one of the colony's most substantial commercial operations. When Andrew Faneuil died in 1738, Peter inherited the business entire, along with the ships, the correspondence, and the credit relationships his uncle had built over decades. The records of that operation, cited by historians including Jill Lepore in her study of American founding history, show a business at the intersection of the Atlantic's most profitable trades. Ships from the Faneuil network carried fish south to Barbados and Jamaica. They returned with molasses and sugar, which were converted into rum in New England distilleries. The rum moved further along the trade circuit, into a commerce whose final leg passed through the West African coast. Peter Faneuil did not captain every ship himself. He managed the trade from a counting house in Boston. The Atlantic commerce worked through networks of agents and correspondents, and a merchant at the center of that web did not need to witness every transaction to profit from it. The wealth his operation generated was, however, inseparable from the West India fish that fed enslaved workers on Caribbean plantations and the molasses those same workers were forced to extract. In 1740, Faneuil offered to fund a public market building for the city of Boston. The city accepted. The building opened in 1742. They called it Faneuil Hall. Today, it is known by another name. It is called the Cradle of Liberty. Inside those walls, in the years that followed, Boston's merchants and politicians debated taxation without representation, the rights of free men, and the principles that would eventually become the founding documents of the United States. The name on the building has not changed, and if that were the only account in this ledger, the story might have ended with one uncomfortable footnote. But there is another institution that requires naming. The plantation economy needed the fish to sustain its labor force. The New England fishing economy needed the plantation market to move its lowest grade supply. By the mid-18th century, these two systems had grown into each other so completely that neither could have functioned at the same scale without the other. The moment that would eventually break both was already approaching. Neither party could hear it. Plantation account books from Barbados and Jamaica, documented by historians of the Atlantic slave trade, including Vincent Brown in The Reaper's Garden, recorded the distribution of provisions to enslaved workers in precise detail. A pound of saltfish per person per week was a common standard. Sometimes a pound and a half. The quantities were calculated by the minimum required to keep workers functional in sugar fields and boiling houses in tropical heat. The fish was weighed to the ounce. The people who received it were recorded differently. An account book might note, "Field gang, 47 persons," against a column showing the barrels distributed. Individual names appeared in some records and not in others. When they did appear, they were names the plantation had assigned, not names these people had carried before. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The structural dependency was so complete that when abolitionists began making arguments against the slave trade in the later 18th century, one response from commercial interests was that ending the Atlantic trade would damage New England fisheries and British Caribbean sugar production simultaneously. The fish and the chains were, by then, economically inseparable. The abolitionists argued that the consequences were the point. People thought they had the full picture. They were wrong. If you want to follow the rest of this history, subscribe now. The comment section will tell us which food to trace next. By 1807, when the British Parliament abolished the slave trade, the cod to Caribbean pipeline had been running for more than a century. Abolishing the trade did not immediately dissolve the system built around it. The plantations continued to operate with the existing enslaved population. The ration continued. The fish continued to cross the Atlantic in barrels stamped with grades invented for this specific commerce. The institution that requires naming now is the Church of England. In 1710, the British general and colonial governor, Christopher Codrington II, died and bequeathed his plantation estates in Barbados to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, an Anglican missionary organization. His stated intention included the establishment of a college to educate enslaved people and prepare them for Christian conversion. That is not what happened. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel ran the Codrington estate as a revenue-generating operation for more than a century. The enslaved people on the estate were not freed. The college was not used to prepare them for liberty. The SPG's priority, as documented by historian Travis Glasson in Mastering Christianity, published in 2012, was the profitability of the estate. The enslaved workers were a capital asset. Their religious instruction, when it occurred at all, was subordinate to their labor output. You would think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Among the practices documented in abolitionist testimony and historical accounts of the Codrington estate is this. Enslaved people on the Codrington property were branded on the chest with the word Society to mark them as the property of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. The Church of England. And somehow it gets worse. The records of the Codrington estate survive. They are held in the Bodleian Library at Oxford and in the Barbados Department of Archives. Those records contain names assigned at the plantation, rendered in the English convention of a given name without family name, without reference to anything the person might have been called before they arrived there. The account books record their labor, their assigned roles, their monetary value to the estate. They record the deterioration of that value as individuals aged or were injured. They record provision distributions, quantities of salt fish, quantities of corn, quantities of other foodstuffs calculated as sufficient to maintain a working population. But the version of the Codrington story that has entered public memory does not include what came after 1833. When the Slavery Abolition Act passed in 1833, it provided compensation to slaveholders for the loss of their property. The SPG filed compensation claims for the people it had held in bondage on the Codrington estate. Those claims were processed and paid. The Legacies of British Slavery database, maintained by University College London and compiled from parliamentary compensation records, documents the SPG's claims. The British government borrowed money to make these payments and did not finish repaying that debt until 2015. The people freed in 1833 received nothing. Under the Act's provisions, they were required to continue working for their former enslavers during a transitional period called apprenticeship, for which they received minimal compensation. The institution that had branded them with its name received payment for their release. We do not know the names those people used among themselves. The Codrington records assigned names. They documented monetary value and labor output. The interior lives of the people held there, the languages they spoke before they were given English names, the places their parents or grandparents came from, what they called one another before the plantation did. None of this was considered worth preserving. The fish they received as a weekly ration was accounted for to the ounce. We do not know what they called themselves. That was the intention. There were people, during all of this, who named the system plainly. Abolitionists who published enslaved testimony, missionaries who broke with their institutions over the question of bondage, formerly enslaved people who dictated their stories to anyone who would listen. The institutions that ran the system largely ignored them until the political cost of ignoring them exceeded the financial benefit of continuing. One of those people was Mary Prince. Mary Prince was born around 1788 in Bermuda, the daughter of an enslaved woman. She was sold for the first time when she was roughly 12 years old. She passed through multiple owners across several islands in the years that followed, experiencing conditions of labor and punishment that she later documented in careful detail. In the Turks Islands, she was put to work in the salt ponds. These were shallow coastal basins where seawater evaporated under the Caribbean sun to leave behind raw crystalline salt, which was raked, bagged, and loaded onto ships bound for Atlantic ports. The work required standing in brine from before dawn until dark, in heat that the ponds concentrated. In 1831, Mary Prince dictated her account to the British writer Susanna Strickland. The resulting memoir, The History of Mary Prince, is the first account of enslavement published in Britain by a black woman. In it, she described the salt ponds. She wrote that the water was extremely disagreeable to her, that her feet and legs swelled and became very sore from standing in the brine, that she was given a half allowance of provisions and had to work under the scorching heat of the sun from 4 o'clock in the morning until dark at night. She was standing in brine before sunrise in conditions that destroyed the skin from her legs, for food rations that were already half of what the plantation considered standard. The salt extracted from the Turks Island ponds moved through the Atlantic commodity trade. Salt was the foundation of the preserved fish trade. Without salt, cod could not be cured to the durability that made it viable for the Atlantic crossing. The enslaved people who extracted the salt and the enslaved people who received the fish as their weekly ration were part of the same circuit, separated by an ocean, connected by a commodity neither of them controlled and neither of them benefited from. Mary Prince eventually reached England with her owner. She found her way to the abolitionist network, dictated her memoir, and became briefly prominent in the public argument over slavery in Britain. Her former owner attempted to sue her for libel over her account of his treatment of her. The lawsuit failed. What happened to Mary Prince after the Abolition Act passed in 1833 is not recorded. Everything that the Atlantic cod fishery had built across 5 centuries was about to work against the communities that had come to depend on it. The clock had been ticking on the fish itself for decades. The scientists who surveyed the Grand Banks populations in the 1980s could hear it clearly. The government received their reports and continued issuing licenses. For 5 centuries, the Grand Banks had appeared inexhaustible. The letter from John Day to the Lord Grand Admiral had used the word infinite, and for most of European history, the description had seemed close to accurate. The fish survived the handline fishermen and the dory fleets and the saltfish schooners. They survived because the technology involved was slow enough and human enough to leave populations intact. The factory trawlers changed that. Beginning in the 1950s, industrial fishing vessels from the Soviet Union, Spain, Portugal, West Germany, and other nations brought factory-scale trawling to the Grand Banks. These were ships capable of processing catch at sea, operating for weeks without returning to port, dragging bottom trawls across the shallow plateau where the cod gathered in their feeding and spawning grounds. The technology could extract in a single day what a dory fleet took a season to accumulate. Canada extended its exclusive fishing zone to 200 miles in 1977 and expelled foreign fleets from the banks. The Canadian fishing fleet expanded to fill the vacuum. The technology they used was the same. By the late 1980s, Survey data from the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans showed northern cod populations at a fraction of historical levels. The reports were submitted to the government. The fishing continued. On July 2, 1992, Canadian Fisheries Minister John Crosbie stood before cameras in St. John's, Newfoundland, and announced a moratorium on northern cod fishing. More than 35,000 people in Atlantic Canada lost their livelihoods within months. Communities that had fished the same waters for 400 years found, in a single announcement, that the fish were gone. The moratorium was expected to last 2 years. The northern cod has not recovered to commercially viable levels. The autumn of 1750, again. The docks at Bridgetown, the merchant vessel at anchor, the barrels unloaded onto the quay. On the head of each barrel, the grade designation that existed for one purpose: West India fish. The people who received that fish each week on the Codrington estate and across the sugar plantations of Barbados carried names the plantations had given them. The records preserved those assigned names alongside their monetary value to the estate. The ration distributions were documented, the barrel counts, the quantities for each field gang. The fish was weighed to the ounce. The names those people used among themselves were not preserved. The records were not designed for that. Mary Prince knew what she was called before the plantations gave her their name. She does not say what it was in her memoir. What happened to her after 1833 is not known. There is almost certainly salt cod somewhere in the cuisine of every culture with a coastline on the Atlantic. Bacalhau in Portugal, ackee and saltfish in Jamaica, brandade in France, salt cod fritters across the Caribbean. The fish crossed the ocean in barrels stamped with a grade invented for people who were not allowed to choose what they ate, on plantations that ran on forced labor, producing sugar for rum, for merchants who built halls in cities where they debated the rights of free men. The name on the hall is still Fanuel. If this history is new to you, subscribe to this channel. We trace the record hidden inside the food we eat without asking where it came from. And leave in the comments the ingredient, the crop, the trade route, whose history you want to follow next. There is a great deal more of it. We have barely started.